The test failed. Well, that's what they said anyway. We had spent months redesigning the quote overview page. The new version was pretty good. It was backed by research and it was built on things that we thought users actually needed. But when we A/B tested it, conversion rates dropped. Now, technically, the old design won, but here's what didn't make the rounds. We identified what to fix and what not to touch. We kept trying to reinforce that this wasn't a failure, this was forward progress, but it didn't matter. The takeaway that stuck was we tried to change it and it didn't work. What happened was that an early interpretation kept influencing how our team thought and acted long after we tried to correct it. This happens a lot, and that can be a problem for you and your team. So stick around and learn from my mistake. What's up, UX fam? Welcome to another edition of the Cognition Catalog, where every episode will dig into a new cognitive bias and explore how that bias can impact how our team works together and what we can do to ensure we don't get caught up in the pitfalls. Because working with people is hard, and the more insights we have into the human condition make it just a little bit easier. Shout out to this week's sponsor, Mobbin. If you're tired of staring at a blank Figma canvas, then Mobbin gives you access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows with a library that grows bigger every week. Kickstart your creativity, streamline your workflow, and level up your design process. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and never run out of inspiration again. To learn more about the continued influence effect, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell down there so you get notified when a new episode drops, so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Rodney, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tina, Adina, and Zoe for all their support. For more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. So here's a story that's probably familiar to anybody who's ever worked on a product team. A few quarters ago, we ran an A/B test. Our team had spent months working on a redesign of the quote overview page. It was a part of the experience that we knew had usability problems, so we were trying to fix them. And we had research to back up the changes. We stress tested with the internal team. Engineering had signed off. We thought it was pretty solid. But when we launched it as a split test, we expected to see at least a modest lift in the conversion rate, but that didn't happen. In fact, the new version underperformed by just a few percentage points, but it was still enough to raise some eyebrows. And that's when it happened. Despite all the context, despite all the effort, despite everything that we learned, people latched on to one takeaway. The test failed. Now that became the shorthand. It became the narrative. It didn't matter what we kept saying, that it wasn't a failure, that we learned so much. It didn't matter that the insights from that test directly informed a much better version 2 that's in development right now. All that anybody remembered was that the shiny new design got beat by the old one. And that story stuck. In stand-ups, we heard things like, let's not overinvest like we did on the quote redesign. In planning sessions, we heard things like, should we validate this more before testing? Remember what happened last time? And even in hallway conversations, we heard things like, well, yeah, but that's what we thought before the quote test. Now, the irony is that the test actually worked, not just the way that people expected. We didn't lose, we learned. But because the first wave of reactions was just utter disappointment, that narrative calcified. It became the dominant version of the story. And that right there, that's the continued influence effect. It's what happens when the first explanation, even if it's incomplete or misleading, continues to shape behavior long after it's been corrected. And this is why correcting misinformation isn't just about setting the record straight. If the original story feels simpler, if it feels more satisfying or emotionally charged, it tends to stick, even when everybody knows better. And in teams, that can be toxic. Because when we label things like learning as failure, we stop taking risks and we avoid iteration and then we settle, all because we let the wrong story win. So what's the continued influence effect? Well, let's dig into it. We tend to cling to incorrect information or beliefs even after they've been clearly corrected. This bias illustrates our mind's reluctance to let go of early explanations, causing misinformation to subtly persist and influence our thinking and behavior even when we're aware that it's wrong. This effect was first clearly defined through research conducted by psychologists Colleen Seifert and Holland Johnson in the 90s. Their experiment showed that once misinformation is presented, it tends to continue shaping our understanding of events, even after the misinformation is explicitly corrected. In their studies, participants often fail to replace initial false explanations that they were given with corrected information, so this showed a persistent influence over time. Now, more studies throughout the 2000s, they expanded on these original findings, and what they uncovered was that the persistence of misinformation isn't due to forgetfulness or confusion, but in reality, it's often linked to how our minds construct a narrative. So when we initially encounter information, we tend to incorporate that idea into a mental story or explanation of events. And when these stories are corrected later, simply retracting a piece of that story often isn't sufficient enough because our brains prefer coherence. So even a false but complete narrative is more compelling to our tiny little human brains than a corrected yet fragmented explanation. With the explosion of digital communication, particularly social media, things like Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, etc., that continued influence effect has gained broader attention. Misinformation spreads rapidly online, and that can become deeply ingrained in our collective memory, even after clear, fact-based corrections. And this has implications ranging from everything from public health campaigns like we saw during COVID, politics like we saw in all the presidential elections and even elections abroad, to daily organizational communications via email, Slack, and other digital communication tools that we use for work. The continued influence effect doesn't just distort facts. It impacts relationships, strategy, and trust. Teams that don't actively track and correct internal misinformation may find themselves solving the wrong problems, or worse, blaming the wrong people. For teams, this effect plays out in subtle but consequential ways. The problem here isn't about fake news. It shows that casual comments, flawed documentation, or early unvalidated hypotheses shared before they're ready can quietly shape a team's long-term thinking. Now, say somebody offhandedly says during a planning meeting that user drop-off is probably due to the onboarding flow being too long. Now, nobody's validated that yet, but that idea spreads. And a few weeks later, people are referencing that same statement in design reviews or roadmap discussions, and by the time actual research shows that the real issue was somewhere else entirely, the onboarding redesign is already in motion. That's the continued influence effect in action. Now, let's say a stakeholder sends out a status update that says something like the last release caused a spike in support tickets. Now, that statement might turn out to be completely wrong. Tickets might actually be completely unrelated, but by that point, it's too late. The narrative's stuck. Future feature discussions might come with added caution or resistance to shipping risky features based on a faulty memory of that event. And over time, the continued influence effect can reshape team reputation, trust, and how future incidents are handled. If an early draft of a postmortem inaccurately attributes blame to a specific team or a specific decision, that detail can carry forward even after updates or clarifications have been made. Well, what can you do about it? Well, here are a few things that you can try. First, don't assume correction resets the story. Correcting an error doesn't mean that the original information is forgotten. If the misinformation filled a knowledge gap, people may keep using it. So be aware of what stories have taken root, even if they're wrong, and try to address them early. And when you do, reframe, don't just retract. So instead of saying that's not true, offer a better, more satisfying explanation. The brain needs a coherent story to swap one narrative for another. If the correction feels incomplete, it won't stick. So thinking back to our example earlier with my A/B test, simply saying it wasn't a failure didn't matter. Instead, we should have been pushing the narrative that we actually learned something and explaining what we learned. Next, identify and address misinformation loops. Look for places where outdated or wrong ideas keep resurfacing. Places like meeting recaps, Jira tickets, recurring debates, or even Slack channels in your company's Slack. Those loops can embed misinformation into the team's collective memory without anyone even realizing it. Next, treat the first version of a story as the most dangerous. Initial information, even if it's wrong, tends to stick. So be cautious about what's shared too early in a project, or especially during a crisis. And if you're a leader especially, when in doubt, delay commentary until you've confirmed all the facts. And then lastly, cultivate a team culture that tolerates being wrong. Continued influence effect thrives when no one wants to admit that they got something wrong. So build psychological safety around error correction. Normalize phrases like we used to think X, but now we know Y, or we thought that way before the study, but afterwards we know this because of Y. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for the Cognition Catalog for today. I hope it helped shed a little bit of light on what the continued influence effect is and how we can avoid some of these pitfalls at home and at work. But I'm curious, have you run any issues related to this bias before? How'd you get through it? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. To learn more about the continued influence effect, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell on there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. And if you want to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some select biases, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/shop. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the promo code YouTube to get 10% off your entire order. And if you're tired of staring at a blank Figma canvas, Mobbin gives you access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows with a library that grows bigger every week. Kickstart your creativity, streamline your workflow, and level up your design process. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and never run out of inspiration again. And if you want to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some select biases, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/shop. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the promo code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, Zoe, and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.